what would you consider the top 3 ingredients that made Israel the startup center that it is today?
Number one is attitude towards risk. This is not something we asked for. We happen to live in a risky business, risk central. We live with existential risk. And yet, it turns out that it's turned out to be a blessing in disguise. Because when you compare the risk of living in Israel to the risk of starting up a business, big deal. Go ahead and start up a company. What's the worst thing that's going to happen? You're going to lose your job. Somebody's going to lose some money. Get over it. Okay, it turns out that risk might be a 4-letter word, but failure is not a 4-letter word. It's okay to start a company and to fail. In fact, it makes you a better investment candidate next time around. If you look at 2 people and you have a choice of investing in one who's never tried it before or a second person who's actually tried and failed, always take the loser, because that loser is going to do better next time statistically than the first time. So it's that attitude towards risk, number one. Number 2 is our approach to going global. One of the things we have going for us is we have no market. If you want to get started in Israel and you want to build a startup company, you've got to get your butt on an airplane and go somewhere. You can't just focus on your local market. And that is a huge blessing. So here in Hong Kong, you are the most global place really anywhere. And you guys get that in your DNA, that you have to go out and get on the road and build a company. And finally, the third thing we have going for us is a strong, what I would call, immigrant drive. It turns out, and you saw it here on stage, that the best entrepreneurs are immigrants. People who come from a different place and take the risk and have built their life. And if you look at Silicon Valley, or you look at the UK, or you look at Israel, it turns out that immigrants who have taken that risk, who have built their life from scratch, who have learned how to worry about banking and promoting themselves and human resources and legal, they've already done their first startup. It was called mylife.com. And that immigrants, therefore, make great entrepreneurs, and immigrant cultures like Hong Kong, which has people from around the world and is multicultural, are very, very strong in the entrepreneurial area.
I think that the UK has certain things going for it that have caused it to begin to succeed in ways I would not have imagined. The first is that it is one of the most tolerant societies in the world. And London in particular is a global melting pot. And much to Jonathan's point of immigrants, new entrants into the UK are reviving the UK and causing it to change at a very rapid pace, especially London. If you look at where startups are starting across Europe, most of Europe is semi-hostile as a startup environment, and thus the UK is an outpost of Europe that most of your startups are moving towards the UK as a result. And I think Hong Kong could have the same critical centrality in Asia, because it becomes an outpost where you have the rule of law, the rule of contract, English as a formal contractual language, freedom of capital, low taxation. Okay, we don't have that in the UK. But leaving that small issue aside, you have, Hong Kong has very similar qualities in its regional position to the way the UK relates to the rest of Europe. And that is, it becomes the best regional place to center a business when you want to access a very large market. And when I look at Hong Kong, it's the best place to center a business when you want to access a very large market. Thus, I think they have much in common.
So maybe I can take a quick poll here from everyone. Say, do you consider Hong Kong to be, Hong Kong startups or young people here to be risk takers? Maybe raise your hand. So that probably gives you an idea. You know, I understand the existential aspect of Israel because obviously, you know, you could just get killed. But in the UK, for instance, how do you bring that out? Because you have the same sort of generational wealth. You know, you have basically sort of the first breed of people who have made money, and now basically, let's say, more cushy second, third, fourth generation. How do you bring out maybe sort of that risk-taking attitude?
Well, I think it's a very interesting question, the question of how do you make risk acceptable in a culture? And I don't think that there's a prescription for it. What I do notice is a couple of things. First of all, to Jonathan's point, I think Hong Kong suffers from existential risk. And so I think that there is the same question about Hong Kong and its long-term sustenance. See, I had a tiger mother. I know exactly what she wanted me to be. She wanted me to be a lawyer. I lasted 29 days in the law. And I think that the cultural challenge in the UK is that very much now in the UK, middle-class parents want their children to become lawyers, accountants, bankers in no particular order. That hasn't largely shifted. What has shifted is the younger generation. I think that we are in a world that's quite a bit more connected. I think you can draw a line probably in the mid to late 20s, and if you're under that line, you have more in common with your peers in another country than you do with an older generation in the same country. And I see that because I teach all over the world, and what I'm finding is cause for optimism. I don't think governments change cultural positions. I don't think we can change a younger person's attitude to risk, but I think we're quite fortunate in the fact that it's changing regardless because they're looking to global icons, not regional ones.
I really think that you put your finger on it when you talk about the mothers. And whether it's tiger mothers or Jewish mothers, they have a very significant role to play. And what's happening in Israel, for example, is the Jewish mother no longer wants her kid to be a lawyer, doctor, God forbid, okay, or an investment banker, hedge fund manager. They want the kids to be startup people. And part of it is because the overall culture has been infused with this wonderful epic story, which celebrates heroes like Yat Siu, okay? No, because the reality is that until he is a household name here, and the people like him are household names, where everybody understands that this is possible, that this is acceptable and this is good, that people get together like this. I saw a bunch of tweets where people were amazed at how many people are showing up here. You need a community which is constantly reinforcing itself with not just the possibility of success, but the success stories and the heroes. Because then what happens is the mothers do get involved. And in Israel, for example, we have 50 or 60 or 70 M&A transactions every year. Each time one of these transactions happens, then there's a little article in the paper which everybody reads. Like you guys all read more or less the same paper. So there's a block in that paper that says, Yossi just made $10 million and his friend Gidon made $20 million. Now what happens is that their mothers know other mothers. And the other mothers start calling their kids and saying, wait a minute, Yoram, what are you wasting your time for at a dead-end job at Intel? Start up, I don't want to die poor, okay? And so what happens is that we need to create that culture, okay, where the mothers are involved, where everybody feels that this game is something worth taking the risk because you can win. In other words, one of the things we share is that we are societies where we celebrate the future, we work hard, we believe in education, but tradition is important. Okay, there are certain cultures in the world where tradition no longer matters. And we don't share that, and I sense that's important here. And so therefore, any approach which says, okay, let's cut loose of the parents, forget about what they think, we're going off on our own, that's not gonna work. And it shouldn't work, because that's part of the strength of what makes this country, what makes my country great places.
As much as I know that tiger mothers are going to remain tiger mothers forever, the focus of their goal changes, but it only changes in the context that we celebrate the people who are succeeding early and fast. And so if Hong Kong wants to accelerate the change, it can only accelerate the change by turning entrepreneurs into heroes and recognizing them for the drivers of economic change that they and we actually are.
I think there's not just one way. I think that Silicon Valley is a spectacular place, but Silicon Valley is anti-traditional to the core. It's all about the rebellion. There is no tradition. There is no filial piety. It doesn't exist. And our society is very different. Whereas Israel is very much a pioneering society and cutting edge, you walk around and you see ancient ruins. My kids are speaking a language which my people have spoken for 3,000 years. They can pick up a shard in a archaeological dig which has Hebrew inscription and they relate to that. So I think that one can be creative and modern and forward-looking and still embrace tradition. I don't think these two are separate. I think that's what makes life even more spicy and interesting, is that interplay between the traditional culture and the new culture. You don't have to cut loose and say everything that came before is not valuable. I don't believe that in my guts. And I think that what happens is that today the world is changing so fast that sometimes some of these ancient truths and some of these traditional views are actually very useful and centering.
You know, when I look at different ecosystems, I think every culture presents different challenges. And I think there is no culture that is free of challenges. And I think that innovation is outpacing culture. And that therefore there's the volatility we are going to encounter in the next 20, 30, and 40 years is far greater than the volatility we've already encountered. We're simply at the first engagement of the globalization of the world. We've only had one battle. We've only had one downturn. We've only had one upcycle. We're at the beginning of another upcycle. The fact of the matter is, this is just beginning, and anything can happen. The game is still completely open, and it's for anybody's to win. And I think that the underlying point that I find true about what Jonathan says and what I believe is that cultures play a larger role in outcomes than anything else. And I think that the cultural change comes from a general enthusiasm for change. 13 years I've lived in the UK, I have seen an utter transformation of its culture. And the UK still has tangible issues culturally. The fact of the matter is, in the UK, we don't, for example, celebrate success without criticism. It's not part of the English psyche to simply celebrate success. There's always a sense of irony. There's always a hinge of something else. And that's the challenge the UK suffers from. And yet it's overcoming its own nascent inability to celebrate success. Having said that, I think that what you need to overcome is your own cultural challenges, but I think that you're going to find that the tide of change will oversweep this, and that you really have nothing to lose but to simply start embarking on this kind of adventure. Back what you're doing next year with 10 times the force that you did this year, and you'll find that Hong Kong changes accordingly.
I believe in the power of equity crowdfunding. I think that until now, most startups have been supported by either angel investors, either individually or through groups, or by venture capital. But in the next decade or two, you're going to see this huge third leg, which is called crowdfunding, take a very, very significant chunk of the market and bring in huge amounts of wealth and resources that we desperately need to fund companies. Just to give you some information, I was sitting with the Minister of Finance here. He estimated that there could be as many as 1 million Hong Kong people who have what are called professional status or accredited status, who could begin to actually fund companies here. So if you look at what we're doing at OurCrowd, for example, we're not doing primarily very, very small fundings. We're doing $1 million plus rounds where we aggregate people from around the world who put in a minimum of $10,000. And what happens is, certainly with OurCrowd, is we curate and select and then diligence to make a safe space. But I believe that this crowdfunding mechanism is going to be a huge, huge asset to Hong Kong and elsewhere in terms of bringing new money into the game.
I think that there's other things that can be done in Hong Kong to drive greater focus of later stage activity. Just as you're running a startup competition today, you can also start to bring people from the UK and Israel who are investment side. I think there's a great number of, crowdfunding and traditional angel activities complement one another. I am an active angel investor. I invest both directly into businesses, and I have begun to invest through crowdfunding platforms. Any day now, I may even use OurCrowd.
God willing.
God willing. But you still need the face-to-face investors at the angel level. And angel level investment is becoming larger and larger, especially as we find ourselves committing to larger rounds, driven largely by Californian activity. And so I think that angels can be brought here. Hong Kong is central, it's not peripheral. And this is the thing people in Hong Kong have to get over. People keep asking me unbelievably silly questions, and I'm here like, well, why is Hong Kong better than Singapore? You're in Hong Kong, you don't need to ask me that question. It's Singapore that should be asking that question. I don't get that question. It's like, well, why not Shanghai? Well, why are you here, you know? For goodness sakes. Yeah. You don't need me to tell you that you're better than them, right? So I think that you're already central. We're here, we're coming. But I think that you could accelerate and amplify that process tremendously. I've certainly been dragged to other countries and found that it was rewarding after I got there, because until you've eyeballed it, it can be very difficult as an angel investor to believe in something. But once you have, you never get rid of that knowledge. And so Hong Kong changes the angel investor if you bring them here. And I think, therefore, it's in your self-interest to not just bring judges and startups to the table, but to also make sure that you congregate global angels.
You guys have the most wonderful tax system in the world. Your tax system rocks, okay? And the most important thing that a government can do is make sure that entrepreneurs are incented.
Interestingly enough, though I am also deeply jealous of Hong Kong taxation living in the UK, I actually don't think that that prompts entrepreneurs to start anything. That's an investor's dream. It's not an entrepreneur's dream, because entrepreneurs don't have any money to tax. Having said that, I think that there is roles for government, and in particular, in many ways, Hong Kong shares certain similarities with the UK. You need to have entrepreneurs' visas. You need to have the liquid flow of talent moving into Hong Kong, and you need to make it utterly easy for them to happen. Entrepreneurs' visas. Second, you need to the degree you don't, and I'm not close enough to Hong Kong to be sensitive to the issue, there always needs to be shelter from regulation for young companies. A perfectly valid law or regulation applied without regard for the size of the company will be fine for a large corporation and crippling for a small one. And unless there's a sensitivity to the size of the company, perfectly reasonable laws that are applied to protect workers or rights in a large company will be very difficult for young companies to prosper in their early years. And finally, I don't get applause usually for regulatory discussions. Yeah, thank you very much. And finally, I think that there is a question, you don't have cap gains tax, you already have a very liberal flow of capital, but I think that governments can also actually be more active in the promotion of startup activity by taking advantage of its convening power. You're doing that today, but I cannot encourage you enough to do it more. You need to build on the success of this. Hong Kong has gotten off to what can be described as a fabulous start. Now the question is, it's your challenge to take it from here.